Good evening, my friends. Real quick audio check. How do I sound? Hello, moderators. Thanks for doing a fantastic job, as always. Good audio. Thank you, Jamie Robbins. Boy, that was quick. I think you were already typing that because you knew I was going to ask that. All right. I did spend a good 2 days reading a fantastic book from 1854. And to answer all those triggered trolls out there that keep coming to my channel talking about those old books are all deceitful. Listen, that's really the only way a lot of people can attack the Archaics data. I mean, you can't if you can't attack the arithmetic and you can't attack the delivery and the presentation, you can't really attack me personally because I already have about the most awful history known to man. So you're left with nothing but to attack the integrity of the source materials. I get it. Most of the people who say that all history is false and that all old books are full of old data, most of those individuals are people who have never even read a book. They're people that have basically, they derive their entire education through videos. I call them Facebook educated. So, but as you know, my Archaics veterans know especially that it's the details. It's these Easter eggs that we find spread out through all these ancient records that show us a whole nother version of history than the one that's been promoted. This is the value of Archaics. We're looking for those Easter eggs. We are actively searching for all those little things out there that make sense of the things that we've never been able to make sense of before. Items that absolutely unravel the BS that's promoted as fact, showing us that they're just mere supposition and fictions. Well, this book from 1854 that I'm going to show you guys actual pages of, this book was written by a guy who is 100% Christian, believed in the infallibility of the scriptures as they were originally presented, but holds by 1854 that a lot of interpolations had happened since the scriptures had been penned, meaning he was smart enough to know that the Bible had been tampered with, and he found a lot of evidence of that. He believes in his book, which I'm going to show you, is that yes, there are corruptions. Yes, there's been deceit. There's, for different reasons, religious, political, whatever, has been introduced into the scriptures, but the actual doctrines had pretty much remained untouched. Interpretations vary from century to century, but the core material that makes the scriptures holy basically was still preserved. And I have to agree with a lot of that, like the red letter edition parts of Jesus, which have been almost untouched. Everything that Jesus said, the things that Jesus did, are things that, we have a lot of problems with that in the Archaics data, because we don't really find that in the historical record. But the teachings of Jesus, the spirituality, the parables, which are images of truth, these are the things that we can agree with. They are timeless, and many of the things that came out of Jesus's mouth, if Jesus even existed, have actually been found in older writings, in older concepts. Yeah, it's not, I am the son of the living God. It wasn't something new to the New Testament. That's found on ancient Egyptian wall texts. So this man was very intelligent, and he was a chronologist. So, he piqued my interest. I disagree with a lot of his arguments because he's really trying to push certain things that are in accordance to his faith. And in the last 170 years since he wrote this book, there's been new discoveries that he didn't have access to, but that's okay. Some of the things he said in this book are profound, and they need to be included into the Archaics data. Ergo, this video. But this is a book monkey. This is 100% a book monkey presentation. So don't think I'm gonna leave book monkey out of this, because book monkey deserves deserves his place in this little deal. You guys know I love my book monkey. I got book monkey back here. I got several. Here's one book monkey. There's a book monkey right there. He's sitting inside of a book. Right there. I got another one. He's up on the shelf holding up another book. Here he is right here. I got another one in my other studio who holds up a lamp. Yeah, book monkeys everywhere. Let a few more people stack up into the chat. But yeah, this guy. So several people over the past year have asked me some really interesting questions. This video is the answer to those questions. They asked me, hey, Jason, the Archaics chronology goes back to 5239 BC, but did you know the Armenian chronology goes back 55 centuries to BC? Did you know that the Ethiopian chronology goes back past 5,000 years BC? So these are really close to the Archaics chronology. The Archaics chronology only goes back to the very oldest verifiable calendrical system, which is the Annunaki Ner system of 600-year periods. And for several reasons, 5239 BC is amazing. And I've showed in other presentations that the actual chronology itself, from 5239 BC, counting all the way down to the 6,000th year of the Annus Mundi system, which is 2106 AD. New people, if you're new, you're not going to understand anything I'm talking about. My Archaics veterans need to hear this, though. 5239 BC itself encodes the exodus from the construct concept, because 5239 BC is 7,344 years to 2106 AD. And we already know that 2106 AD is the 6,000th year. On the pyramid timeline, interesting. Remember, 1902 began the last days. The Great Pyramid has 203 levels of stone to the flat platform at the top, where the chief cornerstone sits, the 204th level. 1902, which is a Phoenix year, plus 203 levels, which is a calendar in stone of years going up to the year 2105. But we're missing a year. Why? Because that's 5,999 Annus Mundi. But if you add 1 year, the 204th year, you get 2106 AD, the 6,000th year. Anybody who has seen my Chronicon can see this. There's no way to undo this chronology. It is fixed. But this is exactly 7,344 inches from the base of the pyramid to the top once the cornerstone is in place. It's called the apothegm. I didn't measure that. I pulled that out of a book from 1926. It's 7,344 inches. 5239 BC is 7,344 years till the cornerstone is in place on the Monument of Man, which is the Great Pyramid. Why is this important? Because the book of Exodus, the dating that I have showed from U.S. cryptographers, Emmanuel Velikovsky, several different Jewish rabbis, many Christian biblical chronologers, including Stephen Jones, in the Phoenix chronology and in Jason Brashear's Chronicon, it is across the board the year 1447 BC for the Exodus from Egypt event during the 10 plagues. But in the Annus Mundi calendar, it's the year 2448. Well, 7,344 years is 2448 times 3. So over and over, I've showed how all this calendrical geometry completely tells us the story that Our sim began in 5239 BC, and it has gone through many punctuated periods called resets, where the holography had to be reset, things had to be put back on course. Older paradigms, the evidence of older paradigms was removed to make way for newer paradigms because the construct does care. The shock value of people surviving through these edited resets would have been far worse had not the editing took place. The editing is cerebral, the editing is holographic, the editing is in the holosphere itself. And because our avatars are jacked into the sim, it's very hard to perceive these edits. Just like calendars are all retrospective creations, none of them were implemented at the time of the event for which started that calendar. They are all ex post facto innovations. At the same time, all history books, all memory, all traditions, legend, lore, everything is ex post facto, meaning after the fact. And because of this, the editing process is real. It's very cogent, and it's hard to detect. This is the whole theory behind Archaics, showing it. It's easily shown, but only retrospectively. So this is what we're doing. I hope you like my Baby Phoenix shirt. This is Baby Phoenix. Pretty cool shirt. Thank you for donating that. So Baby Phoenix and I, we're going to take you on a trip. Once I remove this, let me remove this little deal. See what we got here. I'm going to present, share screen. I'm going to share the whole screen. Or maybe just a window. Let's see here. Really don't know what I'm looking at. Entire screen. I'm going to share this entire screen. Let's see. So we're going to look at some real compelling material here. I'm going to share the entire screen. Share just like that. I'm going to put myself aside. Hey, Shiva Shampoo, how you doing, bud? I got your latest email. I just been super busy. Damian Banks, there's nothing to address. You asking about the Sanchez situation? There's nothing to address. Just because somebody else has a problem with me doesn't mean it's mutual. Yeah, you never heard me say anything out loud. Let's see here. All right. Ex post facto is Mandela effect. Yes, it is. So I know you guys can see this. And I'm going to run through these. I want to be able to see my chat, so I'm going to put this to the side here. All right, so let me know in the chat. I can see the chat now, and I can see what I'm sharing with you. So what I would like you to do is tell me in the chat right now if you can see this clearly. Because if you can see this clearly, I can begin this presentation. I don't mean see it clearly. It's already a blurry. It says a dissertation on sacred chronology. What I mean is, can you see it? Does it fill most of your screen? You should be able to see the chat on the left and this picture right here. I'm just waiting for somebody to tell me in the chat. Looks good. Cool. Thank you, guys. Thank you. That'll work. because I don't really know why it freezes my chat on the screen when I'm trying to share. I don't understand why it does that. Go to new comments. There it is. Now I'm caught up. Perfect. Perfect. 1854, a dissertation on sacred chronology. Now, it says containing scripture evidence to show that the creation of man took place 5,833 years before Christ, to which is added an arrangement of the dynasties of Manetho on a principle which renders Egyptian and Bible chronology. Now, we've discussed Manetho several times, and we'll discuss him some more a little bit here. But Manetho, this is 1856. Manetho was terrible. Many modern scholars agree that Manetho totally botched, and it's to be understood. I mean, here is a Greek historian in Egypt writing a history of all the Egyptian pharaonic dynasties, not really having a good grasp of that history himself, and he stacked the dynasties. And you'll see evidence of that here. But he stacked the dynasties when many of them were co-dynasties because there was two Egypts. So it doesn't matter. We'll get to that in a minute. But in the beginning of the book, there's some really interesting things. He talks about the Samaritan, the Samaritan Gospels and New Testament, the Hebrew New Testament, the Septuagint. He has some really compelling arguments. One of his arguments in this book is that there is zero evidence among ancient authors between those who followed the Hebrew copies of the Bible, the Masoretic text and New Testament, those who followed the Samaritan Chronicle in the Samaritan version of the Bible, and those who followed the Greek Septuagint. For the first 250 years of Christianity, there isn't a hint of any argument about chronology. Many of them threw out a bunch of numbers and all that stuff, but they didn't argue with each other about when things happened. And he goes into great detail explaining and showing passages in the New Testament where if there was a controversy, if there was a disagreement in the days of Jesus as to when certain events had taken place, then certainly the disciples had many opportunities to get clarification for that, and it never happened. It never happened. Between all these different versions of the Bible, chronology was never an issue until after the Bible was standardized by Rome. So this is where it gets interesting. That the Hebrew chronology was never adopted by any Christian church till the Reformation, and then only partially. So we're in the past, in my Archaics presentations, I've showed you guys that the Jewish calendar and Jewish chronology that goes back to 3,761 is a fiction. There is no way, using the date monikers found throughout the Old Testament, that you would ever be able to get the date 3,761 by any species of mathematical analysis. It's impossible. This isn't Jason telling you this. This is hundreds of chronological texts and books have all dated. I mean, even Jewish rabbi chronologists have dated Abram's birth at 1947 BC. We have this in Moses Maimonides. We have this in Rashi. We have this in 2 or 3 modern books that were all published in the last 100 years, like Sacred or Mystic Numbers of the Hebrew Kings. I can't remember who wrote that, but I cited his book where he talks about Abraham was born in 1948 BC. There is no way that you can get 3761 BC, year 1 of the Jewish calendar, and Abram's birth at 1940. It's impossible, and it's very easy to verify because Jewish sources from Josephus all the way to present day all basically say that in the 292nd year after the Great Flood, Abram was born in Ur of Chaldea. Well, 292 years before 1948 BC is our Phoenix year of 2239 BC. Ask Baby Phoenix. Baby Phoenix will tell you 2239 BC, Great Flood, collapse of the vapor canopy, the day the sky fell. That is 292 years before the birth of Abram. So in the Talmud, in the Midrashic texts, and in the Old Testament, in the Torah commentaries, it is known across the board that the pre-flood world was 1,656 years. So it's impossible to get 3761 BC. You can't. You get 3895 BC as year one. It's that simple. 3761 BC never appeared anywhere in the historical record. No Hebrew manuscripts, no Hebrew commentaries, not the Talmud, nothing until about 400 years ago. During the Reformation, all of a sudden, rabbis were saying that the creation of Adam and the beginning of our world was 3761 BC. And yet, there's no chronological way using the scriptures to get that date. It's impossible. So, let's get on to it. I just went on a little tangential rant. That's okay. So let's read some clips to get inside the mind of this most profound individual here. He says chronology, or the science of the computation of time, is a subject to which few persons have turned their attention. The generality, even of those whose reading is tolerably extensive, take everything of this nature on trust. That's really interesting, guys. And from the disregard which they manifest to this department of human inquiry, it would almost seem as if they had adopted the maxim of Voltaire. I wasn't even supposed to read that far. But this guy's a chronologist, and before he begins his going deep into his diatribe, he really makes some very interesting points on the value of chronology and how it's absolutely ignored. Same thing. Not much has changed since 1856, right? It need not be concealed that the ensuing pages may probably disturb the hereditary and prescriptive notions of some of my readers. But if such should be the case, it is time that their notions were disturbed. And the man who cannot bear to have his notions disturbed is never likely to arrive at truth. Man, this man, he's the original Archaicite. This is Optimus Errant right here. This is clearly a duty, and to neglect this duty seems to me like a practical disregard of divine truth and a depreciation of those means of purifying the scriptures from rabbinical corruptions, which an ever watchful providence has placed in our hands. Whoa, that's a hell of an accusation right there. In 1856, this Christian chronologist is accusing the rabbinate of falsifying the scriptures concerning chronological issues. Having been accustomed from early life to regard the authorized version of the scriptures as the infallible and unadulterated word of God, the discovery of discrepancies and corruptions produced at first a painful impression on my mind. Subsequent inquiry, however, soon convinced me that these discrepancies and corruptions were the work, not of the inspired writers, but of the fallible and in some cases unprincipled scribes and translators, and that God had in his providential wisdom and mercy provided ample means by which these mistakes and errors, whether designed or undesigned, might be rectified. Nice. He's saying basically that the oversoul not only knew that the words of spirit by inspired men would later be tampered with, but the evidence of this tampering would still be located somewhere in the script. That is an awesome statement. So I'm not reading this page. I'm just showing you. This is how chapter 1 looks, a dissertation on sacred chronology. Chapter 1, divine inspiration in reference to Bible chronology. I thought this was really good. Like I said, in the beginning of his book, before he gets into chronological matters, he really leans heavily on his belief system, that the original Bible was the word of God and it was uncorrupted, and only by the passage of centuries and translations has it fallen into disrepute and become corrupted from the transmissions. So we're going to skip over all that part because I applaud his faith. But this is a video on chronology. I'm not going to be getting into the doctrinal issues. So he says, I have deemed it right to bring before the reader a series of facts connected with scripture chronology, and which will show, first, that the common notion that Adam was created 4,004 years before Christ is founded on a rabbinical corruption of the sacred oracles. And secondly, that the true Bible computation carries the creation of man nearly 2,000 years farther back. I can't argue that because I already know the 4,004 years he's referring to Archbishop James Ussher's Annals of the World. I have a copy of it right here. Huge book. Somewhere here is Archbishop James Ussher's Annals of the World. Oh, it's so big, it's probably here. I probably can't get it off the shelf. It's probably not going to fit on the shelf. That's why I can't see it. But I've showed it to you guys multiple times before. I found it. There it is. Here it is. Here's Archbishop James Ussher's book, Annals of the World. It's a huge book. In this book, I showed you he accurately dated the Ogygian deluge. But yeah, Archbishop James Ussher was working on several different calendars. One of them was the rabbinical. It's called Seder Olam. It's basically where the rabbis corrupted the chronology and then later incorporated that and came up with the 3761 BC start of the Jewish calendar, which is a total fiction. Do the Jews know it's a fiction? Absolutely. It was a part of the psyop. Yeah, they released a bogus chronology and kept the real one to themselves. So this is 4004 BC. Check out this interesting chart. I circled the part of the chart that shows the original Hebrew text, shows how you calculate the pre-flood world. It's the same thing in an authorized King James version, same thing in the New International Version, there's like 50 different versions. This is the same over and over. This is the Genesis 10 patriarchs and the numbers attached to them. You can see Noah's life was equal to the Annunaki of 600 years. And you can see at the bottom that the duration of the antediluvian period was 1,656 years. There it is. So if you add that 1,656 years found in Genesis for the duration of the pre-flood world, and you add that to 2239 BC, you get year one is 3895 BC, not 3761. It's crazy, because the Jewish chronologers already know that Abram was born 292 years after the flood, which is 1947 BC. How do I know this? Because all their books publish Abraham was born 1947 BC. They know this. So it's not a simple mistake. Jewish scholars are not both geniuses and dumbasses at the same time. That's not how it works. What has happened here is they know the correct chronology and they have specifically hidden it and published the falsified version for the public. Now, so let's get into it, guys. In the side margin, I wrote, Hebrew version and chronology is the oldest, providing us the 1656 years of the pre-flood period. 1656 being divisible by 138, the Phoenix number. Ask baby Phoenix. He'll tell you 1,656 is divisible by 138. I do believe it's 12 times 138. So we move on. Here's another chart. Oh, look at this chart. I circled 292 years. This is in all the rabbinical chronologies. This is in the Jewish encyclopedia. It's right here. Also, 2,000 years ago, Flavius Josephus, in his book Antiquities, wrote, he specifically mentioned that Abraham was born in the 292nd year after the flood. There it is. It's also in this chart right here. Abraham's birth from the flood, 292 years. This is a book from 1856. This man is citing books that go far older. He's showing in the Samaritan Chronicle, Abraham was born 942 years after the flood. He's showing in the Septuagint, he's showing that it's 1,072 years after the flood. What I'm going to tell you, thank you, Kodo Star. What I'm going to tell you guys right now is that there was a lot of confusion back then when the biblical records were being amassed and put together. There was confusion because there are 3 ancient great floods, and my channel has documented all of them ad infinitum, over and over. I have so many presentations and charts that show you the flood of the Gihon flood in 3439 BC. The great flood of Noah, the Noahic flood in 2239 BC, and the Ogygian deluge in 1687 BC. And it is very evident that different chronologies were attached to the years those cultures believed the flood had happened in. But they chose the wrong flood as their reference, their point of reference, and it altered all chronology after that. We'll see evidence of that in this presentation. So, here's another chart. By attending to the first of these tables, it will be seen that the 3 versions agree in one number only, namely the 600 years. Guys, let me explain the importance of this. Looking at 3 separate chronological charts, the oldest being the Hebrew, then the Samaritan Chronicle, then the Septuagint version. Studying these 3 side by side, there's only one common denominator between them, and it happens to be a reference to the oldest calendar known to man, the 600-year Annunaki Ner. Those of you new to my channel, you have no idea what I'm talking about. Everybody else who's been here a while, you know all about the Anunnaki calendar that began in 5239 BC. It started a 600 years, 600 years, 600 years, 600 years, and 600 years. Every 600 years was a key important date in human history. 600 years before the flood, Noah was born. A whole new race was introduced. In 600 years before that, Enki appeared with the Annuna. They brought civilization after the Gihon flood when Nemesis X object destroyed the world. 600 years before that, the moon appeared. It was called the Capture Flood. Civilization was, had divided itself between those who remembered when the moon was never in the sky, they were called pre-Selenites, and those who were born or developed after the moon had appeared. So 5239 BC is exactly 600 times 5 years, or 3,000 years to the Great Flood in 2239 BC. This is exactly what we find in the historian Theopompus, who said that great ages of the world begin and end in a span of 3,000 years. I didn't make that up. Theopompus wrote that. So this is a really interesting statement. The only common denominator between these 3 different chronological systems is a true fact from history. The 600-year Sumerian Ner period of 600 years, or 216,000 days. You know that number. It's everywhere in the Vedic, the Sumerian, and the Mayan systems. So, all right. Moving on, guys. Let's see. The period that elapsed from the creation of Adam to the birth of Abraham was 1,948 years, according to the Hebrew. That is amazing. Why is it amazing? Why is it amazing? Because 1947 BC is 1948 Annus Mundi. Abraham was born at the center of a massive calendrical nexus. One calendar going forward in time from the Adam and Eve reset, 1,948 years forward in time, while the other calendar is retrospective, the Anno Domini calendar, which has BC reckoning going in reverse. 1,948 years from one calendar is here. 1,947 years, they touch right here. How do we know they're the same year? Because of the calendrical overlap. January 1st is not the beginning of the year. The beginning of the year was the vernal equinox. Therefore, 2.5 months of 1948 Annus Mundi is 1947 BC. Abram was born at the exact middle of two timelines going forward and backward in time. And then the cross-calendrical parallel that is born out of that is the fact that if you flip it another 1948 years, you get Palestine, 1948. The Jewish state is created. So we live in a hologram, guys, but this isn't a video on cross-calendrical parallels. We've already covered that many times. So here it is in the oldest version, the most correct version, the Hebrew version, we find Abram was born 1,948th year of the calendar, which happens to be our 1,947th year BC. So in the Samaritan, we have 2,249 years. And in the Septuagint, we have 3,334 years. And the reason being is that the chronologers for the Samaritan Chronicle and the Septuagint Chronicle used a different flood for their factoring. We'll get to that. Bobo Jangles, you're late, man. You're tardy. So, the fifth author is Josephus, the great Jewish historian who flourished about 35 years after Philo. In his Jewish Antiquities, he traces the history and chronology of the Old Testament throughout its entire records and states, in some cases, with minute exactness, the various chronological periods. In some cases, I just reread that. If, therefore, the chronological dates of the three versions had differed then as they differ now, he must have noticed them and assigned some reason why he adopted the dates of one version to the exclusion of those of the other two, but not the slightest allusion to any discrepancy whatever occurs in any part of his works. What is being referred to here is very, very compelling. The author itemizes all the ancient, he lists them. He lists a bunch of ancient authors that are all talking about different chronologies and different systems and stuff. Those who supported the Hebrew, those who supported the Samaritan, and those who supported the Septuagint. And he shows that in none of these ancient records, not even in Josephus, is there a single argument to be found as to when an event occurred. To this man, he interprets this data differently than I do. I think it's astonishing that I found this in a book from 1856, that this man went through all these old authors and found out that there were no chronological arguments during these centuries. That's amazing to me. But this is the value of having more data. In 1856, this Christian author completely interpreted that fact very different than how I interpret it. He interpreted it to mean that the Hebrew version, the Samaritan version, and the Septuagint version, he believed all these manuscripts never varied with each other. They all had the same chronology because all these ancient authors quoted from them freely and never mentioned a single chronological dispute. But all of a sudden, the copies we have in 1856 They're all full of chronological errors. None of them agree with each other. In his mind, he's thinking that someone introduced the chronological errors recently. This is how complex it gets. I agree with him partially, but there's a deeper phenomenon happening here that he never brought to the table because he's a religionist and a staunch Christian and believes 100% that the New Testament was giving us accurate history and that Jesus will actually walk the earth and that there was sun darkened and there was a massive earthquake, even though we have 10 surviving historians today who are all living in that time that never mention any of these events going on in Jerusalem. And I've got other videos in my Dark Scriptures playlist that talk about this. I list all these ancient historians, not a peep from them in their works of anything unusual going on. No sun darkening, no earthquake, none of this Christian purges, none of this stuff was going on. Instead, what was going on during that time, the Romans were rounding up the Jews and purging them because the Jews had been implicated in financial conspiracies all throughout the Roman Empire. And the Romans had basically burnt Jerusalem to the ground, overturned the stones, salted the fields. They did it twice. That should tell you something. But where this Christian author got it wrong is the assumption that these texts are as ancient as they pretend to be, and they're not. All throughout my Archaics research, I show you they're not that old. They're not that old at all. He believes the apocryphal version of the Old Testament being written way back 500, 600, 700 years BC. And it's not true. Ezra and Nehemiah admit that 100% of the Old Testament was lost and that the people that later became known to Jews knew nothing of Moses. They knew nothing of the temple, of David, of Solomon, of none of this. So Ezra, a priest, and Nehemiah, a politician, got together and they hatched a plan and they come up with this idea that to write these scriptures, they took all these historical records, they put all this together and introduced it to their people, and they introduced them to Yahweh and Moses in the burning bush. And this is the 5th century BC. Dark Scriptures playlist goes into these details. What this author has shown is that none of the ancient authors that talk about all kinds of biblical history ever once claimed that there was chronological differences between the Hebrew versions, the Samaritan versions, and the Septuagint versions. And I'm telling you now, the reason though they can't be found in Jerome and Augustine, they can't be found in Ignatius, they cannot be found anywhere in Polycarp. None of these chronological statements can be found by any of the church fathers simply because none of these versions existed at that time. So, and this is the subject matter of my Dark Scriptures playlist. So it's really compelling because this is more evidence to what I've been saying, but I had never thought to go through all the ancient authors and look for arguments about chronology because they argued about everything else in the world. It's crazy. But they never laid accusation that the Samaritan's wrong and the Septuagint is this, or the Hebrew's wrong and the Samaritan has it right. None of them ever did that. They never, and this is not something they would have ignored because they argued on everything else, everything doctrinal, everything, all quotes. They argued on everything, but not on chronological issues. And there's chronological issues mentioned everywhere in the church fathers. The church fathers had dates for all kinds of things in the ancient world, and we'll get to that here. Okay, so we're done with that statement. It's going to get deeper, guys. So he says, it is credible if the 3 versions of the scriptures contain the same differences then, which they do now, that neither Christ nor his apostles should ever have alluded to them. Is it credible that corruptions and discrepancies so serious should have been allowed to pass without the slightest amativersion? Is it credible that these discrepancies could exist without the knowledge of the Jews? And is it credible that amid the various perplexing questions which they proposed to Christ, they should never have imposed upon him the task of reconciling their conflicting chronologies? Christ charged the Jews with corrupting their traditions, but he never charged them with corrupting the scriptures. But had the corruptions existed then, which exist now, on what principle could he have omitted to charge them with an offense so iniquitous and flagrant? Not a word of the kind, however, was uttered either by the Redeemer or his inspired ambassadors, meaning James, Jude, the Apostle Paul, John. None of them address chronological issues. This guy's making a very good point, but it doesn't prove what he wants it to mean at all. The point he's actually proving is that these arguments didn't exist then because those chronological passages in those ancient texts did not exist then. There was nothing to argue about if something wasn't written till centuries later. So, but can it for a moment be believed that Christ and his apostles would have acted thus if one of these versions had been corrupted in the manner in which it is now? From these considerations, then, the conclusion seems irresistible that the corruptions in question did not exist during the time of Christ and the apostles. Again, his position is that the Hebrew, the Samaritan, and the Septuagint copies of the scriptures existed in ancient times, and that there were no chronological differences between them. My position is that he has uncovered absolute evidence that the scriptures didn't even exist in those days. They didn't, they're ex post facto. They were written way after all these events. Therefore, in writing ex post facto, the authors who contrived to write all these versions of the scriptures never thought to include arguments about different times and all that. They never did it because they didn't invent those different times till centuries later. Oh, I'm running low on coffee. Okay. So we have now taken a view of the evidence, negative and positive, in proof of the proposition that the present conflicting computations of the three versions did not always exist. In the first place, there is no intimation of any discrepancy in any writer from BC 280, 280 years BC, before Christ, to the commencement of the second century after Christ. It's a 500-year period he's talking about. All the ancient authors that he's itemized, there is not a hint of any chronological disparities among them. No authors accuse other authors of having the wrong dates. So, and then in the second place, we have the express testimony of Philo, Josephus, and the Jewish Sanhedrin that the Hebrew and the Septuagint were in perfect accordance with each other. Stronger evidence on such a subject cannot be required, and therefore its conclusiveness on that question cannot with any propriety be challenged. Okay, I'm only giving you guys the business in part. But he spent pages and pages and pages showing this evidence and providing these arguments. I'm giving you a brief synopsis, and his arguments are very compelling. Thank you. His arguments are very, very compelling. Again, just because somebody finds a body of evidence does not mean it proves their point. It can actually lead to a deeper truth, which is what I'm conveying here. So, and in the commencement of his first book against Appian, this is Flavius Josephus 2,000 years ago, In his first book against Apion, speaking of his antiquities, he remarks, these antiquities contain the history of 5,000 years and are taken out of our sacred books, but are translated by me into the Greek tongue. Flavius Josephus did that. Guys, this is very compelling. Flavius Josephus told us that Abram was born 292 years after the flood. We are told across the board in almost all Jewish references, modern and old, that Abram was born in our year of 1947 BC. 292 years before that was 2239 BC, which is the date biblical chronologist Stephen Jones dated the Great Flood, which is the date of the 600-year Annunaki nerve system, which started in 5239 BC, which is the date of the Phoenix phenomenon, collapse of the vapor canopy on the 138-year timeline. It is also the date of many other chronological studies that I've gone through on my channel, just basically ad nauseum. So to see that he's also claiming that 2,000 years ago, they were already well into the 5,000th year of history, it makes me appreciate Flavius Josephus all the more. Because everybody else in his time period was totally disagreeing with that, except for those who followed one of the other versions that was used dating a different flood. It provides us, it's where we got the Ethiopic Armenian calendars. It's the reason why they have the 5500 BC dating. It's because when they were putting their Old Testament chronologies together, they didn't use the flood of Noah as a date of reference. They used either the Ogygian deluge or the flood of the Gihon flood of 3439 BC. So when civilization appeared, when according to the Sumerians, the Anunnaki appeared, the Annuna appeared. So this is very compelling because we know the Archaics chronology has shown that the oldest calendar that we can actually verify and follow all the way through history. Calendars aren't just a single event that starts a year. Now, as I've shown in Archaics, to be a calendar, it has to continue on key dates to be self-referencing. Not only self-referencing, it must be a part of cross-calendrical parallels. We live in a hologram. In a hologram, all the key nodal points are periods on a calendar that mirror other periods on a calendar that can be verified. In isometric projections, palindromic sequencing, cross-calendrical parallels. I've got hundreds of examples on my channel of these repetitive histories. 5239 BC shows us every 600 years significant events in human history. So, and this is the subject matter to a few videos in my Annuna files if you're interested in that calendar. But Josephus here is admitting that we have history, human history that does go back that far. And that right there is very impressive to me because he nailed the 292 years dating of the flood. He nailed the birth of Abraham. Flavius Josephus is also the one that told us that the pre-flood period was 1,656 years, but he didn't know anything about the Phoenix phenomenon. He didn't know that 1656 was divisible by 138. And if he did know it, he didn't know what it would have been related to. So I'm very impressed with that right there. Here's a reference to Diogenes Laertius, the biographer of the philosophers, places the creation at 6,138 BC. Why do you think he did that? Now, you have to understand, it was a belief by many Christians. It was a belief by many Christians hundreds of years after Christianity supposedly started that Jesus appeared in the 6th millennium of the world. That's over 5,000 years. So it's very interesting that Diogenes Laertius would write that the creation was 6,000 plus a phoenix period of 138 years. This tells me that 17, 18 centuries ago, Diogenes had access to historical chronological material that convinced him of a 6,000 year period, because I've shown those records in ancient texts that concern a 6,000 year cycle. But he was also cognizant of the importance of the phoenix in the creation event, which is encoded in the book of Genesis in Hebrew as Neph, which is the same as the Egyptian Noph, phoenix. In Genesis chapter 1, the Spirit hovered over the waters when the world was dark. It's after a massive destruction. Well, Spirit that's hovering over the waters is Neph. So we have this combination here with Diogenes of a 6,000 year period, and he included the Phoenix period of 138 right here. It's entirely too specific. So now we move to Isidorus Hispalensis, who flourished about the year 304 AD, places the creation 5,210 years before Christ. That's really interesting. 5239 BC is the beginning of our chronological sim. This entire simulated experience that we're undergoing now began in 5239 BC. You guys know, my Archaics veterans, I call it the Nemesis simulation. This is the one we're in right now. That's when it began. It's gone through several phases. You can call them resets, you can call them epochs, you can call them whatever. I refer to them as biospheres because there's been fundamental changes to the world every time, and the human genome is specifically designed to adapt to those changes. This is why we have so many varieties of the human species. We're all human, but the variety is one of the key clues as to the history of our world. Here it is right here. So Eusebius, the bishop of Caesarea, says Professor Russell, what is this? Eusebius thought proper to diminish the period between the creation and the era of our redemption to 5,200 years. Guys, this is not a light statement. Again, here we have more proof of the Nemesis simulation start 5239 BC, which is year one of the ancient Annunaki nerd calendar. Here's another reference to it right here. I don't know what records Eusebius had, but I've read Eusebius, and I know he cites over 100 ancient authors. I'm very familiar with Eusebius. I'm also familiar with the interpolations that scholars have found in Eusebius, meaning that in promoting the Christian religion, Eusebius was an agent of Rome who was specifically basically on the mission from Rome to create a history that verifies the authenticity of Christianity. That was his job. And this is the opinion of many, many biblical scholars. They know that Eusebius was a plant, he was an agent, and he falsified many records. But it doesn't mean everything he said was untrue. He has a lot of chronological material that had nothing to do with Christianity in it, because he cites many, many events of the ancient world and how many years that happened between them. Now, Eusebius is great. But when it comes to matters of doctrine, Eusebius was a plant. But we're talking about chronology. And in chronology, that's a really good round number. 5,200 years before Christ. That's almost a scientific bullseye for 5239 BC. Now, Justin Martyr, who was put to death about 164 AD, placed the creation of Adam 5,000 years before the birth of Christ. Now, you have to understand, guys, this may not be true. And what I mean is in 1856 and earlier writers would have used the creation and Adam interchangeably. But it's not true. As I've shown in Archaics and the Chronology, Adam came way after the creation. So And remember, Adam is a pronoun invented by Jewish rabbis to describe ancient mankind, taken from Babylonian texts, where Adam was actually Adamu, which is a word for humans, mankind. So it's in the Babylonian syllabaries, Adamu and Lulu are almost the same. So Lulu was the old Sumerian ideogram for sheep, but it was a reference to people. So and the great ones, the Annuna, were shepherding the people. So anyway, the reason I'm splitting hairs is because Justin Martyr may not have said the creation of Adam was 5,000 years before the birth of Christ. Somebody else may have said that. He may have just said the creation was 5,000 years, and that would have been correct. And when I say creation, I'm talking about the Nemesis simulation. I'm not saying that this construct hasn't been here for hundreds of thousands of years, but it is a construct. And I'm not here to argue that. All the greatest minds in physics are now on board. Even computer programs, those who run machine learning, deep learning, you can look across YouTube and you can see more and more and more people are all on board with simulation theory. Archaics is not about proving simulation theory. There's too many people already doing that. All I'm trying to do is bring a whole nother school of thought to the field, and I've done that. And that's chronology, showing that we live in a simulated environment using the chronological records of the ancient historical periods. Simple as that. That is Archaics in a nutshell. So Justin Martyr also agrees in the 5,000 years before Christ, which is great. It's awesome. Moving on, Isidore of Pelusium, who wrote about 412 AD, reckons 5,336 years from Adam to the birth of Christ. Again, somewhere down the road, somebody misinterpreted a chronological frame of reference and combined Adam with the creation when they were not combined in the beginning. There's a 1,344 year difference in Chronicon. I've shown this from 5239 BC, the beginning of the Annunaki Ner calendar of 600-year periods. The 600 years I showed you is the only common denominator between the Samaritan chronology, the Septuagint chronology, and the Hebrew chronology. That 600-year periods began in 5239 BC. And then 1,344 years later, we have year one of the Annus Mundi system, when the phoenix, called in Genesis Neph, passed over the dark waters after a reset. It's called the Adam and Eve reset. So this is highly specific. 5,336 is really specific. So he's not really talking about Adam. He's talking about the beginning. Somebody started throwing the name Adam in, but it's really a reference to the beginning of the chronology. And then Sulpicius Severus, who flourished about 420 AD and made an abridgment of ecclesiastical history from the creation to AD 400, places the creation at 5,469 years before Christ. Here is proof of what I'm telling you. They used Adam interchangeably with the beginning of the construct, the beginning of all known calendars in the ancient world. I am showing you in this video from old authors that there was a knowledge that the beginning of our world started around 5239 BC. And that's amazing, because I'm pulling all this data from a book in 1856 where the guy is actually trying to prove something else. Now, all this is good. It's good stuff. So Jewish Talmudists placed the creation at 5,344 years before the vulgar Christian era. Look at that number, guys. Archaics veterans, what do you see when you see that number, 5,344? That is in the Talmud. It is the Jewish version of how old the world was before Christ, before the AD Anno Domini system started. What do you see here? you specifically see 5,344 years is precisely 2 millennia, 2,000 years less than the whole calendar of 7,344 years. From 5239 BC, the start of the Annunaki Ner 600-year periods, counting 7,344 years, all the way to 2106 AD, the descent of the chief cornerstone, the return of the stone the builders rejected. It's the 6,000th year of the Annus Mundi calendar, which began in 3895 BC, when baby Phoenix, known as the Neph, hovered over the dark waters in Genesis 1 and began the evening and the morning was the first day, and started the day count system of the vapor canopy. How do we know? Because the evening and the morning was the second day, and then the evening and the morning was the third day, and then the evening and the morning was the fourth day. And Christian eschatologists believe that Jesus appeared in the 6th millennium BC for two reasons. One, the calendars went back that far, like I showed you with 5239 BC, but also they believe that Genesis chapter 1 is a prophecy of the Son of Man in the 6th day, in the even, and God created the animals and the beasts and the birds of the air and the animals, and the evening and the morning was the 6th day, and God made man, and he saw that man was good. Christian eschatologists look back at the creation event story in Genesis and claim that that means the Son of Man was introduced into the world in the 6th day. A day unto the Lord is as 1,000 years. This is a tenet of eschatology, that days signified periods of time, like 1,000 years. So it's very interesting, guys, that Jewish Talmudists would place so much significance on the 5,344 years, as if they themselves knew that there was still 2,000 years left in the timeline. Those clever guys. So concerning Bede had a really good chronology. Oh, he was a scholar. He wrote in Latin. But concerning Bede, he was denounced a heretic because he had taken upon him to assert, in opposition to the fathers of the church, that the Redeemer of our race was not born in the 6th millennium of the world. Now, I just covered this, but this is actually the crux of the matter. Early Christianity adopted the Septuagint because of a belief in Christ was born in the 6th millennium since the creation event. But the truth is, they just merely knew the beginning was about 5239 BC. Over a period of centuries, they lost the understanding of why all the calendars began at that time and began attributing it to the center of focus of the new faith, Jesus. So we have of the Septuagint. Okay, the labors of Vossius, Pezron, Hayes, Jackson, Hales, Russell, these are all chronologists before 1856, and others have thrown a flood of light upon this once difficult question, and the rabbinical Hebrew has been shown to be encumbered by so many contradictions and difficulties, arising especially from its utter inconsistency with the best established facts in ancient history, that now, as Bishop Russell observes, it is everywhere rejected by sensible chronologists. So I need to hammer this point in, guys. What he is saying is that the Jewish calendar, 3761 BC being the beginning, the Jewish calendar, according to all these eminent chronologers and according to his own research, going through all these historical texts and using the chrono markers found in the Bible, the conclusion across the board is that the Jewish calendar is a lie. There is no way to add all these historical events up and get the year 3761 BC. It's impossible. So can't hammer that point in enough, guys. So, okay, at the same time, namely around the year 128 AD, this is 19 centuries ago. A new translation of the Hebrew into Greek was published under the auspices of the leading rabbis, for the express purpose of supplanting the use of the Septuagint. This translation was executed by Aquila, who had been a pagan priest, then a Christian, and finally a Jewish proselyte. 2 years afterwards, namely in the year 130, the Seder Olam Rabbah, or Great Chronicle of the World, was published by Rabbi Josi and patronized by the notorious Akiba, who in the reign of Hadrian supported the pretensions of Bar Kokhba, the pretended Messiah. I've told you guys about this. Why the Jewish calendar is 134 years off. Well, I've already explained from a totally different perspective of how they completely changed the calendar at this time period and then kept these changes to themselves, only to be discovered later. This is the Bar Kokhba rebellion, 135 AD, when the Romans came and totally decimated Jerusalem, sold the population as slaves, put most of them to the sword. It started the diaspora, and the Jews fled to Persia, back where basically their leaders were. They went to Persia, called the Exilarchy, or Alexandria, Egypt, or most of them fled into the cities of Europe. And the Europeans, not knowing of the terrible histories that were going to unfold when they let these people into their cities, open their city gates and let them in. It's called the diaspora. You know, that's the subject. Archaics TV, I have a whole series of videos that tells you this history. I will not publish this on YouTube. So, Archaics TV has all this history from the diaspora going on forward. And they're long. They're 2 hour and 20-minute long videos, and each one of them is packed full of data. And yeah, guys, it's serious. Those of you who are members of Archaics TV, you can tell them in the chat how deep the Hats Off series goes. Now, so it was in this work that the abbreviated chronology was first brought out, and then was laid the foundation of that immense difference which now exists between the Hebrew and the Septuagint. So in 1856, he's laying out his evidence as to why these differences exist. But I've already told you, I don't believe that. I believe his research is solid and that he did uncover the fact that there is no chronological disputes found in 500 years of ancient historians. We can read Jerome, we can read Eusebius, we can read Ignatius, we can read Polycarp, we can read we can read the New Testament. Nobody's arguing about chronological issues. And he's right. And he cites many other authors that I haven't cited. But he's right. There were no arguments in early Christianity about the dating of anything. But it's not for the reason he's saying in 1856. He's assuming the Samaritan Chronicle, the Septuagint, and the Hebrew Masoretic text were widely distributed, well-known books of the ancient world at that time, and they weren't. They weren't. And I've showed in Dark Scriptures how the layering of the New Testament came to be. It wasn't fast. It took a long time to basically ratify what was going to be the New Testament. And most of the church fathers in 300 to 400 AD are very, very different in the things that they cite. And they cite books and histories and authors that scholars today say they can't find a single reference to these people ever existing, because this is what scholars do. They cross-reference. If someone is mentioning a historian named Tralles who said a certain thing, then they cross-reference that. And they look for any reference in 200 ancient authors who mention Tralles. Who mentions Tralles? And when they find out that only the Christian authors of Eusebius and Jerome and Augustine of Hippo are naming all these ancient historians for which nobody else has ever heard of, we have a problem, Rome. We got a real big problem. But this is an academic pursuit. It's not my pursuit. It's just something I have noticed in my Dark Scriptures playlist. But here we find that he has uncovered all this evidence, but it's not evidence that these three ancient versions of the Bible existed. That's not. It's evidence that those three versions of the Bible didn't exist because no one mentioned a Samaritan Chronicle. No one mentioned a Septuagint. No one mentioned. All these are later Christian writings that claim these books were written at these periods of time. But we don't have any authors that lived in those periods of time that make any cross-referencing to any of this. And the authors that did live in those periods of time didn't mention those texts, like Philo Judaicus, like Flavius Josephus. You understand? This gets deep, guys. It's not something that you can just easily dismiss. I promise you, academia doesn't. That's why about 95% of all biblical academics, all biblical scholars, don't believe the Bible. Simple as that. So, I'm not saying there's not spiritual material to be gained at all. I'm saying the historicity is ex post facto. It is invented. All right, so where are we at here? All right. Take again the chronology of the kings of Judah and Israel. And here too, it is impossible to close our eyes to the fact that some of the dates must have been altered by the carelessness of transcribers. So manifest are the discrepancies that the united labors of the most eminent expositors and critics for hundreds of years have been unable fully to reconcile them. And every investigation that has been instituted on the subject has terminated in the conclusion that some mistakes in the transcription must have taken place. He's basically saying that the period of the kings and judges in the Old Testament cannot be historically accurate. All the chrono markers don't make sense. They just don't make sense. Because when you line them all up, there's no way that these events could have been abbreviated in this short of time when you say all these numbers. And this isn't Jason telling you this, and this isn't this dude telling you this. This is all academia. This is all biblical scholars, biblical chronologists. They know that period doesn't make sense. But they don't need it. You don't need it at all because chronology is easy. Like I said, 1947 BC was Abram's birth, and it's a calendrical nexus. It's 1947 Annus Mundi as well because of the calendrical nexus of the ancient year overlapping the modern year. Abraham was 292 years after the flood, 2239 BC. The flood was at the end of a 1656-year period. It's in Genesis, very clear. That makes year 13895 BC. But from the birth of Abram, we find out in the scriptures that the Exodus happened 500 years after the birth of Abram. That's really easy. 1947 BC minus 500 is the year 1447 BC, which is 2448 Annus Mundi. It's so easy. And then we find out that the Temple of Solomon foundation was laid in the 480th year after the Exodus. Okay, that's so easy. 931 BC was when this occurred. So it is so easy to reconcile all this, but the problem is the minutia. The minutia is all the little things about how many years this judge was, how many years this king reigned. And nobody needs biblical chronologists. Don't even need all that. You need the main historical events, and then you can easily line up biblical chronology with secular chronology. It is so easy. But the problem shows that if you go by just the numbers in the period of kings and judges, it adds up to 590 years of history. But in the Bible itself, it claims it's only a 400-year period. So, yeah, it's little discrepancies like that. But that's neither here nor there. It doesn't change anything. So, as there is every reason to believe that the object contemplated by the projectors of the Septuagint version was to fulfill the desires entertained by the rulers of the synagogue of supplying their people resident in the Grecian kingdoms with a copy of the law in a language which they could read and understand. So we find that the version was authorized by the high priest and the Sanhedrin to be used in all their places of divine worship as the faithful translation from the Hebrew original, and as such, entitled to the same respect and veneration as the other. Now, what he is saying is that the Greek Septuagint version of the scriptures was permitted to be copied from the Hebrew into Greek. And his argument is that it was during this period that all the changes and all the mistakes were made with the Septuagint in chronology alone. I can agree with some of that. By all accounts, the Hebrew Old Testament is the older version, and the Greek Septuagint is a later production. As a translation into Greek, this means the chronological differences were introduced into the Septuagint. So, Greek input altered the older 1656 years of the pre-flood period into something else. What it altered is very compelling. It's very interesting. It's a part of my argument now. So, on this page, he goes into a lot of detail about the pre-flood world and different stuff. So, the author in 1856, a Christian who believes these people are real: Adam, Enos, Seth, Mahalalel, Jared, Lamech, Noah. He believes all these people were real. Okay, now he believes the differences in their ages between the Samaritan and the Septuagint versions to be proof that the Hebrew or older version was chronologically in error. What have I been telling you? It doesn't matter. All the minutia doesn't matter. It's the key events that we use to date and show that the biblical history matches the secular history. But that's okay. But the truth is, the original writers perfectly preserved the 1656 year period, but the 10 patriarchs are inventions, actual descriptions of major events. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, in my Annunaki Files playlist, I show you where Adam, the Jewish scribes in the 5th century in captivity in Babylon, in the Babylonian libraries, saw the histories of the Adamu, and they created the name Adam. And they placed Adam at the beginning because that's where the word was used in the chronologies of ancient Babylon. The Adamu was a description of early humans, early people. Now, the next in line was Set. They kept seeing Typhon and Phoenix, and they saw that it had some evil connotations or destructive connotations. And this is exactly how they created the person of Set in their Genesis narrative. Because Set ended up being the Sethites and was the conqueror. And this is how Phoenix was viewed in the ancient world. It was basically Neph in Genesis. It caused the creation. It was a beneficial sign in the beginning. So, like the Bennu bird was beneficial. Bennu bird was housed in the mansion of the Phoenix in Heliopolis in Egypt. So we also have so Set was Typhon. I showed you guys many times they're interchangeable. Set and Typhon, the Phoenix, are all interchangeable. So we also have the Jews created the name Jared, the father of Enoch. But what they read on the ancient Sumerian texts that were translated through the Akkadian into Babylonian Semitic, what they had read in the Babylonian temples was that Oannes, the leader of the Annunaki, whose name also was Enki, appeared at this period of history. So they invented in the Genesis narrative Jared. Jared is the Hebrew word for to descend. This is what we find in the book of Enoch. The Watchers descended. This is where the Annunaki, the Annunaki, led by Enki, descended out of a mountain. So we get this over and over and over, and we find, and even Enoch is nothing but a Semitic version to the Sumerian Enki. So these Jewish scribes reading all these things in Babylon put all this together, and the one thing that they kept was the divine chronology of 1656 years. My Archaics veterans know how important that number is. And you know that Rashi 1,000 years ago even wrote that the world is destroyed in periods of 1656 years. It is a Phoenix number divisible by 138. The ancient Jewish scribes understood the importance of that number and they kept it, but they filled it with a bunch of BS. So So we get to this is interesting. So the Romish Church too thought contrary to the Latin Vulgate, though contrary to the Latin Vulgate, adopts substantially the same system, reckoning 2,242 years from the creation to the flood. So the Church of Rome had access to a chronology that basically told them that the creation to the flood was 2,242 years. I'm going to show you otherwise. The same computation obtains amongst the Egyptian Copts, the Abyssinians, the Armenians, the Ethiopians, and the Georgians. Here we have an explanation for why the Armenian calendar, the Ethiopic calendar, different European calendars, all these nations that derived their chronological knowledge out of the fragmenting Eastern Orthodox Christian Byzantium Church. When Constantinople fell, which was ancient Byzantium, when Constantinople fell to the Turks and became Istanbul, all these manuscripts were already corrupted. Manuscripts went into Armenia, Central Asia. They went into Slovakia. They went into southern Russia. These manuscripts already had introduced a corruption. But the Jewish chronologist and historian, philosopher, prophet that we know of as Michael Nostradamus was admittedly Jewish. Nostradamus, in his own records that have been published widely, specifically states that from Adam to Noah was 1,242 years. Remember, Adam is just a reference to the beginning. The beginning in Hebrew is Kedim. So from the beginning to Noah was 1,242 years. This is a number divisible by 138. And it appears that in translation from Hebrew to Latin, a scribe merely added 1,000 years. How many times in Archaics have I shown you that somebody added 1,000 years or took 1,000 years away from a date to basically alter the text, alter the meaning of the text, or to add significance to the historical prestige of their countrymen? Here it is again. Somebody simply added 1,000 years to the 1,242 years, which is known in Jewish texts. 1,242 is a Phoenix number divisible by 138. If you add 1,000 years to 1,242, you get the Roman Church's chronology of 2,242 years, which was the origin of the chronologies that were inherited by the Eastern Orthodox Roman Church at Byzantium, which fragmented when Istanbul was created and the Turks took over, and there was a massive exodus of text, libraries, and people catching out to all these places. And it's why the Armenian version, it's why the Ethiopic version, it is why the Russian versions all have a different dating for the creation at about 5,500 BC. This is why it happened. It's my theory that the 1,000 years wasn't done by the Romans. It was done by the Jews. The Jews have always had the correct chronology. They had the 1,242-year chronology, but they had published for Rome in Latin a chronological discrepancy, just like they had published in the Greek Septuagint further chronological discrepancies, while they themselves possessed the accurate chronology. Remember, they publish for the public that 3761 is the creation. It is the beginning. It's Jewish calendar year 1. Yet secretly they say Abram was born in 1947 BC, which is impossible, and yet this is what all the Jewish sources say. And then they also publish that Abram was born 292 years after the flood, and that the flood was the 1656th year of the Jewish calendar, according to Genesis. None of that makes sense unless they specifically cited inaccurate chronological material when they allowed their text to be translated from Hebrew into Latin, Hebrew into Greek. That's when the chronological errors appeared. So, and this is why there's such a divergent. This is why the Egyptian Coptic calendar mirrors the Abyssinian, African, the Armenian, Ethiopian, the Georgian calendar, Central Russian steppes. This is why all these calendars are all basically the same and they're very different. But if you remove this Jewish corruption, you're basically left with 5239 BC as the beginning. So again, here's another example, guys. Here's another example. I've showed you many, but here is another example. This simple example of discovering that somebody introduced 1,000 years to the 1,242 years of the Jewish recognition from Adam to Noah. Here it is right here. Here's another example that Phoenix is the keeper of the calendar. Over and over and over, I've showed you this 138-year referencing corrects the calendar everywhere and makes it synthetic, as I've shown in my Chronicon. Here it is. The Phoenix, no matter what we do, calendars going forward and backward in time, new wars, resets, new calendars appearing, old calendars dying out, the Mayan long count over and over and over. I showed you guys. The Phoenix system of 138-year periods always corrects the misinformation. It's amazing. So, we have, secondly, here's where he's taken off. Secondly, there is positive evidence of corruptions having been introduced into the Hebrew scriptures by the Jews. This is 1856. He says, Eusebius presents the same charge. For speaking of Justin Martyr, he observes that Justin records certain prophetical declarations in his discussion with Trypho, showing that the Jews had expunged them from the scriptures. Wow. After this one, I'm going to show you guys a humdinger. Let's get to this one first. Justin Martyr addressed Trypho the Jew. He observes, I entreat you to remember that your rabbis have taken away entirely many texts of scripture from that version which was made by the elders who were at the court of Ptolemy. They're saying that a version of the Bible was written at the Alexandrian library. I don't know if that's true or not. I haven't seen any evidence of that activity outside of Christian extra canonical writings that many scholars say are forgeries of Rome. So I don't know. But let's move on. Here's the humdinger. Listen to this. And then the celebrated Abu Faragius, the primate of the East. This is Byzantium, the Eastern Orthodox Byzantium Church, Constantinople, who flourished about AD 1240, asserts that the Jews, believing it to have been foretold in the law and the prophets that Christ was to be sent in the last times, in order to produce a reason or apology for rejecting him, altered the chronology of the world. Almost 900 and something years ago, it was published that it was known by chronologists that the Jews altered the chronologies of the world because they were incensed that Christianity had basically pushed Jesus as being the Jewish Messiah, and this pissed them off. There it is. That's over 900 years ago. It was stated that it was known that Jewish scribes altered the chronology of the world to argue against Jesus being the Messiah. I'm not sitting here promoting Jesus as the Messiah. I'm not promoting that. Don't misuse my quote. Don't misuse my quotes here. I'm saying that this was the argument of the times, and it was known in Byzantium that these alterations had been done and who did them. So in this section of the book, the author dates the Great Flood to the date of the Gihon flood. This is key to understanding why so many chronologies are different. It doesn't make them wrong. They only chose the wrong flood as reference point. The author dates the Great Flood to the date of the Gihon flood, 3439 BC, which is an understandable mistake. The Septuagint adherents likewise followed. This provided those who followed that chronology, it provided them 3100 BC as an acceptable start date for the Egyptian civilization. And this is exactly what we find by scholars today. Academia today has published in all the books and all the encyclopedias that the 31st century BC is the beginning of Egyptian civilization. This is what they published. They stuck to that. And it was all from a mistake. It's all from a mistake when they used the Gihon flood as a frame of reference for the flood instead of the flood of Noah, which was 12 centuries later. Simple mistake, guys. It's simple chronological mistake. So now he goes into a lot of detail in the book too. And for the next several pages, he makes the accurate argument that the ancient Israelites were a branch of the shepherd kings, then ruling over Egypt. This makes them Amorites or Amuru, called Westerners in all the ancient texts. Even today, scholars describe the Amorite Canaanite branches of Syria, Palestine as Western Semitic. So in 1856, he basically nailed it, who the Israelites were in the historical record. He nailed it. That's exactly what I got in my Chronicon. The Israelites were a branch of the Amorites. This is even admitted to in Scripture. In the Old Testament, it specifically states that Abraham's father was an Amorite. Oh yeah, it says that. Let's see. So Mr. Poole remarks that soon after the establishment of the Thinite Kingdom, Lower Egypt became an independent state, and Memphis was its capital. And in perfect accordance with this, Mr. Kendrick also observes that from the time of Athothus, who built the palace at Memphis, we may consider it as the capital of the old monarchy. He's talking about the two different Egypts right here. So let's see, I marked the bottom on red. He's showing the differences. He's showing that different dynasties coexisted, and the problem with Manetho's histories is that he did a linear projection of dynasties, and that's not how Egypt was. The reason he got such a long, convoluted Egyptian history is because he stacked the dynastic reigns of monarchs instead of running them side by side. In 1856, this guy in this book realizes that the same dynasty for the Memphite was the same one for the Thothis, meaning Lower Egypt's dynasties were identical to Upper Egypt dynasties, but they're recorded differently by Manetho as if they're different time periods when they're not. They're the same time period. This abbreviates all of Egyptian history to way after 2239 BC, way after the Great Flood of Noah. And it makes it even with the Elamite, with the Elamite civilization, the Akkadian, the Babylonian, Assyrian, Rashamra, the Ugaritic, the Hittite, the Mitannian, Urartian, all these ancient civilizations that were after 2239 BC, Egypt falls right in line with them once you understand what he's telling us in 1856, that the dynasties that were two different dynasties in Egypt, because Egypt was not a unified country. And I have showed this over and over on my channel, where Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt are 420 to 430 miles apart, with nothing but desert in between them. Upper Egypt does not have pyramids. They buried their pharaohs in the Valley of the Kings. Thebes and Waset and Karnak and Dendera and Edfu. That's all old. That's all civilization. It's a whole different Egypt. This was the red-skinned race of Egyptians. But Lower Egypt was the Egyptian Nile, where the 9 bows are, was the Great Pyramid, and all 130-something other pyramids were all over 400 miles away. on the Mediterranean coast. It was a different Egypt. It was a cosmopolitan Egypt. It was an Egypt that was run by many different races and many different empires. And this is what this guy is saying in 1856 as well. This is where Manetho made his great mistake. There were two kingdoms. There were two Egypts. And the Israelites ruled one of them for a very long period of time. I didn't say Jews, guys. I said Israelites. So we end this presentation with a friend of mine, goes by Daddy Resonance here on YouTube. He sent me these pictures right here. This is the 1902 version of the Jewish Encyclopedia. Says here, prepared by more than 400 scholars and specialists. Well, if that's the case, then it was peer reviewed by Jewish academics. And if that's the case, then we shouldn't ignore this statement here, where we find the chronological system, the Jews was derived, like most of their science, from the Greeks. All right, I'm going to have to hammer this in, because in Archaics, I have already published the data sets showing you that even Vedic Indian scholars, even Sanskrit academics admit that the zodiac that we have today did not come from India or Babylon or Sumer or the ancient world. Vedic scholars admit that the zodiac was imported into India from Greece. The Romans admit they got the zodiac from the Greeks. The only zodiac ever mentioned in any ancient text as existing in Egypt, nowhere in the ossuaries, nowhere in the wall text, nowhere in the pyramid text, nowhere in the coffin text, nowhere in the Egyptian Book of Life, known as the Egyptian Book of the Dead, actually, nowhere in these texts are a reference to the zodiac. And yet, in Dendera, the Greeks built a temple. And in the temple, the Greeks used Egyptian styles and all that because that was the fad of the time. Greeks were ruling in Egypt when, in 80 BC, they finished a Greek temple in Egypt. And it's the only zodiac there. But it was built by the Greeks during the Greek occupation of Egypt. I've showed over and over in my presentations, guys, the zodiac is not old. It is not old. So we have the Septuagint, we have the New Testament, I've published the material that the Old Testament, it came from the Greeks, from the Greek period. Never came from ancient Jews or ancient Jewish scribes. All that is ex post facto history. We have admissions from all the Latin authors that everything they knew, their entire pantheon of gods, came from the Greeks. This is crazy. We have an admission from Jewish academia that their own calendar and chronological system came from the Greeks. The reason I'm hammering this point in, guys, is because I'm going to be releasing a series of videos that now that we know the Hermetica, Hermetica sciences, the alchemical sciences all relate to the Greek interpretations. We know all this material funnels back to the Greeks. We know the New Testament was written in Greek. We know that the Apocalypse, the book of Revelation, was a Greek text. We know that it came by virtue of Cerinthus, who preserved the ancient Greek Sibylline oracles, for which we got the book of Revelation, how the church stole those records and claimed that John on the Isle of Patmos received the revelation when it's not. Everything about the revelation is Greek oracles from the era of the goddess. Everything about the revelation is from the Greek Sibylline oracles. They are oracular. The reason I'm hammering in this point is because we have to understand the elite today operate on the Greek Olympiad calendar. Not only the Olympic ceremonies are telling us their next moves and all that, like I've shown, not only was the first seal broken of the book of Revelation, we would have never been able to make that interpretation had we used Judeo-Christian interpretations. Judeo-Christian interpretations has hundreds of millions of Christians and Jews today completely waiting on events that have already transpired. They began in 2020. When you use the Greek interpretation of the breaking of the first seal, everything makes sense. And you understand why all hell's going to break loose in 2024. Is it the end? No. It's an awakening period. Even the presidential elections, which affect the entire world, are on the Greek Olympiad calendar. Every 4 years, we have an election. When interpreting the book of Revelation, not just the seals, but the entire book of Revelation, we must use Greek syntax, Greek grammar, we must look at the Greek cognates and root words. We must use Greek lexicons to understand. This is a very deep prophetic text. We have to review Greek mythology to understand the connotations. Using the Judeo-Christian lens of interpretations will box us in as it's boxed in hundreds of millions of people today. I'm not going to, as long as I'm living and breathing in this world, I'm not going to allow that to happen. I am going to reveal the contents of the book of Revelation as it is meant to be decoded using all Greek ciphers. I am not going to interpret it in the corrupted misinformation, this total massive campaign of 2,000 years of disinformation to get me to look in other directions when it's been staring at me in the face from the beginning. The reason why everything is going through a Greek filter is answered in history. What I mean is when there was the Israelites began, before the Assyrian deportations, the Israelites, it is recorded in the Old Testament that there were 4 major periods of hunger when it induced the people to go to the Phoenician ports and sail away. Whole fleets of Israelites sailed into the pages of history, and they founded great civilizations seated in Ionia, in Miletus, in Thyatira. They went to Athens. They went to Laodicea. They went to all these different places. And this is why the Apostle Paul, who didn't know a thing about Jesus' miracles, virgin birth, histories, raising the dead, to the Apostle Paul, it was Christ and him crucified, a faith in the resurrection. It wasn't an actual man who had done all these things, because Paul never quoted a single thing Jesus ever said. Paul never even mentioned a single miracle Jesus ever said. But he had the Spirit. The letters of Paul are the oldest parts of the New Testament. All scholars agree that the 13 letters of Paul are the oldest versions of the New Testament. And yet, there's nothing in those letters that show a supernatural Jesus. What they do is preach of a Christ and a Christ crucified, the anointed one who came and sacrificed himself for the preservation of human immortality. That is the message of the 13 letters of Paul. You don't get any of these mythological attachments in those letters. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John came way later. This is why the 13th letters of Paul never cite anything in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, because they didn't exist. I don't want to go too far on a tangent, but my point in this video is that we have to disentangle the Christian and the Judaic misinformation, and we need to embrace the Greek, because Paul was very specific. He said that his letters were addressed to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and the letters were sent to Thyatira, Macedonia, Athens, Ephesus, Miletus. They were sent to the 7 cities of Greece. We need to understand the cipher before we can decipher the book of Revelation. So this is the journey we're on, guys. Archaics, I'm going to release a bunch of videos on a bunch of different topics, but my general focus right now is on this book of Revelation. because we've been fed some bullshit and it's time to untangle it. And for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, you will if you go back and watch my video on decoding the first seal broken. You'll understand everything then. So I've been having this share screen on for a while, haven't I? Let's see here. All right, stop sharing. Done with that. Open this up. I have no idea how long I've been running my mouth, guys. My screen's back open. Hey, Wendy, how you doing? That's my presentation, guys. It's a really great. It's a great book. It's a good read. It's 84 pages, and like I said, his research is excellent. However, it doesn't quite prove his point. It literally proves another point. That's why I love these old books. And for those who like to follow along in the old books that I'm always giving these details about, I do have a thumb drive that's available. You can click onto the link in the description box that takes you to my website, and there's a whole link index on how to order stuff and all that. But I'll never get through all these old books. I'm 50 years old, and my standing bibliography right now is probably close to 1,500 books that I've read and researched. I mean, it's almost impossible to read. I mean, it took me 20 years in prison to read 1,300 texts. And I'm talking about nonfiction reference books, very dry reads, hard. Yeah, it's I read a lot of fiction too, but people just don't have the time to do that anymore. And a lot of people today, like I began this video, a lot of people are triggered. They don't like the fact that they come to my channel, they see this data, and they don't like the fact that I'm presenting all this material. They hit that wall of cognitive dissonance, and it's easy to dismiss all the material because of its ramifications. It's easy to dismiss Jason of Archaics as just saying, oh man, those old books don't have real data. They were full of lies too. That's real easy to say until you look at the data and you see that all these Easter eggs do add up to something. They add up to a basket. But if you're unwilling to look into the basket, I don't need you in Archaics anyway. If you're unwilling to follow the data, don't believe me. Look at what I present. We are reasonably intelligent creatures. You can make up your own mind, but don't come to my channel triggered with all that BS, because you're going to suffer the same thing everybody else has suffered. I have blocked thousands of people from my channel. So have my moderators. I just have zero tolerance. Like I said, I've been saying it a lot lately because I feel that way. It's too late to be polite. You come to my channel triggered, I'm gonna deal with it. Simple as that. I got way too much on the line and way too much moving forward to entertain any negativity. You got questions, I answer them in the chat a lot. But sometimes you guys ask questions that I've already answered 100 times. So if you're unwilling to do the work and watch the presentations, I'm unwilling to entertain your curiosity. It's as simple as that. I think that's fair. But hey, guys, I don't want to rant. I don't want to keep going all night. I see now it's been 2 hours. My presentation is over. And yeah, Errol G, don't get triggered. See what Errol said right there? Don't get triggered. I need a t-shirt, Errol. Don't get triggered. Maybe we can put a baby phoenix on it. That's great. Hey, guys, I love you guys. But I got food on my mind. I'm glad we got this presentation out. It was a good one. It was a good one. I think I've done a few live videos. I haven't done a Q&A, so I think my next live video is going to be a Q&A before we go into some more deep stuff. So I'm thinking that this weekend would be a good time for a Q&A. I don't know what it would be a Q&A over. I've done 2 or 3 advanced Q&As. I may as well, I might do a simple one, because I didn't do a simple one. I did an Archaics for beginners the other day, but there was no Q&A attached. Maybe if you guys are patient with me, maybe I should do a Q&A for beginners. Maybe I should do that. Let me know in the comment section if that would be a good thing to do this weekend. I'm going to release another video, but as far as a live video, I think this weekend should be a Q&A for beginners. I don't know. Y'all let me know what you think.